Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into a topic that's, well, it's promised a lot over the years. Socialism. The idea of a more equal, maybe more just society.
It's a powerful idea, definitely.
But the reality, when you look at how it's played out, it can be surprisingly stark sometimes.
That's often the case, yeah.
So our mission today is really to unpack the arguments presented in our source material, especially the case against socialism. We want to give you a fact-based picture looking at the theory, the history, and, the consequences, both economic and political.
Trying to stay neutral, but laying out what the analysis shows.
Exactly. So expect a journey through different kinds of socialism. You've got the very centralized versions, then the more democratic attempts.
Right.
We'll focus on why, according to this analysis, these systems often run into issues like economic inefficiency, stagnation, and sometimes even political repression in the more extreme cases.
It's a complex story.
It really is. Let's dive in. First up, definitions. Broadly speaking, socialism means the means of production, factories, farms, that kind of thing, are owned or controlled by the public or the state.
Not private individuals. That's the key difference from capitalism.
Right. And it goes back to thinkers like Marx, who saw it as a way to a classless society, producing for need, not profit, aiming to get rid of those capitalist inequalities.
Distributing wealth based on need, that was the ideal.
But it's not all the same, is it? There are different flavors.
Oh, absolutely. You've got orthodox Marxism, think revolution leading to communism. Then there's democratic socialism using the ballot box, keeping democracy intact.
And social democracy, like Scandinavia.
Yeah, that's different again. They generally accept a market economy, but have a really strong welfare state and regulations. We'll probably circle back to that distinction.
Okay, so the basic appeal is fairness, cooperation.
That's the core promise. Marx and Engels argued capitalism inherently exploits workers, creates conflict. Socialism, they thought, would fix this. Collective ownership of labor's output.
Production plan for people's needs, not just profit. Cutting out waste from competition, making sure everyone has the basics.
Exactly. And there's often an assumption baked in, that people will work hard for the common good in a fair system, and that democracy should extend to the economy, too.
It sounds, well, very idealistic, theoretically powerful. But, okay, let's unpack this. Where do the theoretical challenges begin when you look at the actual mechanics of an economy?
Right. Well, a really foundational critique comes from economists like Ludwig von Mises back in 1920 and Friedrich Hayek later on. It's called the economic calculation problem.
Okay, what's that about?
The core idea is this. A centrally planned economy has a massive information problem. Without market prices, prices set by supply and demand, the planners just don't have reliable signals.
Signals for what?
Signals for what's needed most urgently, or how to allocate resources efficiently. Think about it. In capitalism, prices tell producers what consumers want, what's scarce, what's abundant.
Right, like a communication system.
Precisely. Mises and Hayek argued that no group of central planners, no matter how smart, could possibly process all the constantly changing information that millions of daily transactions convey through prices.
So what's the predicted outcome then?
Misallocation. You end up with shortages of things people desperately need, like bread or shoes, and surpluses of other things nobody wants, maybe too many tractors of the wrong type. The system just can't calculate value properly from the top down.
Okay, that makes sense. An information bottleneck. What about the people in the system? You mentioned human motivation earlier. How does that fit in?
That's another huge critique. Incentives. The argument is if rewards are shared equally, or if your basic standard of living is guaranteed regardless of how hard you work, well, where's the motivation?
To work harder, to innovate.
Exactly. Capitalism uses the profit motive and competition to drive productivity. People benefit directly from their efforts or good ideas. Socialism, especially aiming for equality of outcome, can blunt that.
So people might just do the minimum.
That's the concern. John Stuart Mill worried about the natural indolence of mankind way back in 1848. He thought people might stagnate without competition or personal gain.
And more recently.
John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist, observed something similar. He basically said humans generally don't rise to the idealistic heights of working purely for the common good. You kind of need that carrot and stick approach.
Interesting. So the focus on equality might actually hurt productivity and maybe stop new ideas from developing?
That's the potential downside, yeah. Lower productivity, maybe slower technological progress.
Okay, information problems,
Yeah.
incentive problems. What about freedom? Does controlling the economy inevitably mean controlling people more?
That's the third major critique. Comprehensive economic planning tends to concentrate enormous power in the hands of the state.
Because the state controls jobs, industries, goods.
Everything, really. Hayek, in his famous book The Road to Serfdom, argued that this level of control inevitably clashes with personal liberty and democracy.
Even if the planners mean well.
Even then, to make a central plan work, you have to enforce it. And enforcing it might mean suppressing dissent, telling people where to work, what they can buy. Hayek warned that this path, even if started democratically, could lead towards authoritarianism.
Okay, so those are some big theoretical hurdles. Let's move to how this played out in practice. Marxist-Leninist systems. This is where socialism really got implements on a massive scale, right?
Yes, think 20th century, the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Cuba, North Korea, Eastern Europe for a time.
And the model was the Communist Party runs everything. State owns all industry, all land. Central planning dictates the economy.
Right. 5-year plans, state set targets for production, fixed prices, private business heavily restricted or just outlawed.
And politically.
One-party rule, authoritarian, often justified as the dictatorship of the proletariat. But in reality, it meant no opposition allowed, heavy censorship, secret police.
Repression.
Severe repression. Political and civil liberties were basically non-existent. The Communist Party had a total monopoly on power.
You mentioned the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin. The gulags.
Exactly. Millions sent to labor camps, no freedom of speech, press, religion. You couldn't even travel freely inside or outside the country without permission.
And this wasn't unique to the USSR.
Not at all. Mao's Cultural Revolution in China was incredibly brutal. East Germany had the Stasi, monitoring everyone. North Korea remains a totalitarian dynasty today, completely isolating its people.
And you're saying this lack of freedom wasn't just like a bug, but a feature.
In many ways, yes. Controlling the economy made political control easier. You could silence dissent by threatening someone's job or apartment. It's telling that no Marxist-Leninist state ever held free. Multi-party elections while keeping the planned economy. The human cost was just staggering.
Millions dead or imprisoned. Generations denied basic rights. Okay, so politically, pretty grim. What about economically? Did the planning work in terms of growth?
Well, initially, sometimes there were gains, especially in taking agrarian societies and forcing rapid industrialization. The Soviet Union in the 30s, Mao's China in the 50s, they did build up heavy industry.
But at a terrible human cost, you mentioned.
Horrific costs. And once those initial gains were made, the centrally planned economies really struggled. Lack of competition, lack of profit motive meant state-owned companies became inefficient, sluggish, slow to innovate. Workers had guaranteed jobs, so, why knock yourself out? Quotas were often met in ways that didn't actually help anyone.
That bureaucratic inertia you hear about.
Exactly. Resource misallocation became chronic. By the 70s and 80s, the Soviet bloc had really low growth rates. They were falling way behind the West in technology, living standards, just about everything consumer-related.
Are there clear examples of this divergence?
Oh, absolutely. Look at East and West Germany. Started from basically the same rubble after WWII.
Right.
West Germany embraced market capitalism, democracy boom, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, became Europe's powerhouse.
In East Germany.
Socialist planned economy, Soviet model. It grew, yes, but much, much slower. By 1989, when the wall fell, West German GDP per capita was nearly double East Germany's.
Wow. And that meant real differences in daily life.
Huge differences. West Germans had far more cars, better housing, more food choices. People were genuinely shocked by how run-down and outdated East German infrastructure was after reunification. The planned economy just couldn't keep pace.
And the Koreas, even starker.
Even starker, divided after WWII. South Korea went the capitalist route, became a high-income, industrialized nation. Think Samsung, Hyundai.
Global brands,
Right. North Korea stuck with a rigid command economy, and it just stagnated. The difference is visible from space at night, South Korea blazing with light, North Korea mostly dark.
And the income gap.
By the late 2000s, South Korea's GDP per capita was something like 18 times higher than North Korea's. 18 times. One country thriving, the other enduring poverty and periodic famines under total state control.
That really paints a picture.
It does. And beyond those specific cases, the overall record is pretty consistent. Socialist planned economies lagged behind capitalist ones in growth, innovation, and just providing basic goods for their people. Think of the queues for bread in the Soviet Union, or the infamous Trabant car in East Germany. Shoddy, unreliable.
Innovation mainly in military or prestige projects like space.
Mostly, yeah. Civilian technology really suffered from the lack of dynamism and incentives.
But perhaps the most damning part, according to the sources, are the human tragedies. The Holodomor in Ukraine.
Yes, 1932-33. A devastating famine. And the consensus is it was largely man-made, caused by Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture.
Taking grain from peasants to meet state quotas.
Exactly, crushing independent farming, leading to a production collapse, and then confiscating what little food there was. Around 3.9 million Ukrainians died, maybe 5 million or more across the USSR. Not a natural disaster, a policy disaster.
And China's great leap forward.
Similar story, different place. 1958-62. Mao's push for rapid industrialization and collectivization into massive communes. It was chaos. Pulled farmers into backyard steel furnaces, ignored agricultural knowledge.
Resulting in famine.
The Great Chinese Famine. An estimated 30 million people died, the deadliest famine in recorded history. Again, directly linked to rigid planning, bad policies, and officials reporting false successes.
30 million. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
It is. And these weren't isolated incidents. Stalin's purges killed at least 1 million. Millions more died in the gulags. Mao's Cultural Revolution, maybe another 1 million dead. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia tried to create an agrarian utopia, killed about 1.7 million people, a quarter of the population.
Cambodia. Just horrific.
And North Korea, even more recently, had a major famine in the 90s, killed maybe 600,000 to 1 million, runs vast prison camps. The Black Book of Communism back in 97 estimated maybe 94 million deaths under communist regimes globally. More recent research suggests at least 80 million.
So the combination of absolute power, utopian goals, and no checks and balances.
Proved absolutely lethal time and time again.
Okay, so by the late 80s, these systems were failing.
Clearly. Economic stagnation, growing discontent. Then Gorbachev tried reforms in the USSR perestroika, glasnost.
Opening things up a bit.
Yeah, and it basically unleashed forces that couldn't be controlled. The 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991.
Exactly. These regimes mostly fell apart under the weight of their own failures. People wanted freedom and the prosperity they saw in the West.
And other communist states?
Well, China and Vietnam undertook major market reforms. They're still ruled by communist parties, but economically, they've embraced a lot of capitalism. That's what fueled their growth.
And places like Cuba, North Korea?
They remain largely isolated, centrally planned, and relatively impoverished. So the overall takeaway from Marxist-Leninism is pretty negative, according to this analysis. Economic failure, political tyranny, immense human suffering, a real cautionary tale.
Definitely. But not all socialism aimed for dictatorship, right? What about democratic socialism, trying to achieve socialist goals through democracy?
Right. This is distinct. The idea is to use elections, legislation, democratic processes to move towards socialism, maybe even beyond capitalism eventually, but always preserving political democracy and rights.
So nationalizing industries, worker co-ops, but gradually lawfully.
That's the general idea. It gets confused with social democracy, but the aim is often more fundamental change than just a strong welfare state within capitalism.
Okay, have there been attempts at this?
One prominent example often cited is Chile under Salvador Allende from 1970 to 73.
Elected democratically.
Yes, elected on a platform of a peaceful transition to socialism. His government nationalized copper mines, banks, other industries, imposed press controls, redistributed land, had popular support initially.
But you said 70 to 73. What happened? It's fascinating how quickly the economic picture shifted there.
It really is. The economy quickly ran into major problems. Production fell, shortages appeared partly due to those price controls killing incentives, and inflation just soared.
Government printing money.
Largely, yes. And political polarization got incredibly intense. Society was deeply divided.
Leading to the coup in 73.
Right. A military coup, backed covertly by the U.S., overthrew Allende. Democracy collapsed. Now, external factors were involved, but the internal economic chaos and polarization were severe. It showed how democratic socialism could provoke intense disruption and resistance, potentially leading to authoritarianism from the other side, completely against the original intent.
What about Western Europe after World War II? Britain's Labour Party, for instance.
Good example. The Labour government elected in 1945 was at the time quite explicitly democratic socialist. They nationalized coal, steel, railways, created the National Health Service, NHS. France did similar things.
Popular policies aimed at rebuilding.
Initially, yes. But over time, many of those state-run industries in Britain became inefficient, losing money, needing constant subsidies. Think British Leyland cars, for example.
Right, and the 70s in Britain.
Yeah.
strikes, inflation.
Exactly. Stagflation, low growth, high inflation. The infamous winter of discontent in 78, 79. Things got so bad that in 1976, the UK actually had to get an emergency loan from the IMF. The budget deficit was huge.
An IMF bailout for Britain.
Wow. It showed the heavily socialized model wasn't working sustainably. And it really paved the way for Margaret Thatcher in 79, who came in promising to roll back socialism, privatize industries, curb union power.
So even democratically introduced socialist policies could be economically unstable.
That's what the experience suggested. We saw something similar in India, too, with its license Raj period of heavy state control leading to slow growth, before reforms in the 90s spurred development.
Okay, fast forward to the 21st century. Venezuela is a really prominent and cautionary example, isn't it?
Extremely salient, yes. Early 2000s, Venezuela was oil-rich, a democracy. Hugo Chavez gets elected in 98, starts his Bolivarian socialism.
Nationalizing industries again. Oil, telecom, power.
Yes, progressively socializing the economy. Price controls, currency controls, massive social spending funded by that oil money.
And initially it seemed to work.
Poverty?
Fell.
For a time, yes, especially with high oil prices. Subsidized food, healthcare, education. The poor saw real benefits. It was hailed by some as a success story for democratic socialism.
So what does this all mean for the long game of a system like that?
Well, the analysis suggests it was built on sand. The socialist policies fundamentally undermined the country's ability to produce things.
How so?
Price controls destroyed farming and manufacturing incentives. The nationalized oil company, PDVSA, was plundered for social programs and riddled with mismanagement and corruption, so investment and maintenance collapsed.
So when oil prices dropped?
The whole thing imploded. Hyperinflation, literally hundreds of thousands of %. Government debt default, collapse of basic services, power grid, water, hospitals.
And the economy?
Shrank massively. GDP per capita fell about 40% between 2013 and 2017. Poverty soared over 80% of households by 2016. Chronic shortages of everything, food, medicine.
Leading to that huge refugee crisis.
Nearly 8 million people fled the country. Over a quarter of the population, just devastating.
And what happened to democracy during all this?
It eroded, then collapsed. Chavez, and especially his successor Maduro, dismantled checks and balances. Packed the courts, sidelined the opposition legislature, held fraudulent elections. Freedom House calls it an authoritarian regime now.
So it started democratic, ended autocratic.
That's the tragic trajectory. When the economic policies failed, instead of changing course democratically, the regime clung to power by suppressing opposition. It's a stark warning about how democratic socialism, in practice, can face immense pressures that might lead away from democracy itself.
Okay, so summing up democratic socialism morally, better than the authoritarian kind, but still plagued by similar economic problems. Efficiency, innovation issues.
That seems to be the pattern. And politically, it's vulnerable. Voters get disillusioned if the economy tanks. Businesses might flee if they fear nationalization. It often leads to intense polarization.
So the conclusion here is it hasn't really provided a durable, prosperous alternative either. Attempts got reversed or, like Venezuela, went down a darker path.
Yeah, suggesting a real tension between ambitious socialist economics and maintaining a healthy, stable democracy.
Right. Now let's tackle the example everyone brings up. The Nordic countries. Sweden, Denmark, Norway. High taxes, great welfare states. Isn't that successful socialism?
This raises an important question. Is this actually socialism?
Good point, is it?
Well, according to most analysts, and importantly, the Nordic countries themselves, no. It's a crucial distinction. They are social democracies. Meaning they haven't abolished markets or private property. Far from it. They have thriving capitalist economies with lots of private businesses. They just tax that wealth heavily to fund extensive public services.
So they rely on capitalism to pay for the welfare state.
Exactly. It's not socialism in the classic sense of state ownership of the means of production. If you look at rankings like the Index of Economic Freedom, Nordic countries often rank very high, sometimes even higher than the U.S. because they have strong property rights, free trade, light business regulation.
So market economies with big welfare states, not planned economies.
Precisely. The Danish prime minister famously had to point this out, saying, Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. They just choose to provide a lot of services collectively.
And historically, didn't their success start before the really big welfare states were built?
That's another key point. Sweden, for instance, had incredible growth between 1870 and 1970 with a relatively free market, small government approach. It was already rich and quite equal before the massive welfare expansion in the late 60s and 70s.
So the welfare state was built on an already successful capitalist foundation.
Yes, and a foundation of high social trust and a strong work ethic, which also predated the large welfare state.
So what does this all mean for what happened when they did experiment with socialism-like policies, like really high taxes or more state ownership?
Well, when they pushed those policies furthest, they did run into trouble. Sweden in the 70s and 80s is a good example.
That period of slower growth you mentioned.
Yeah, marked economic slowdown, high inflation, and eventually a financial crisis in the early 90s. The government's share of the economy got huge. Taxes were incredibly high, marginal rates, over 80%, even for middle-class workers at one point.
80%.
Yeah, and effective taxes on companies could even exceed 100% in some cases. It stifled entrepreneurship. Some famous Swedish founders actually left the country during that era.
So what did Sweden do?
They realized they'd gone too far. Starting in the 90s, they implemented market-oriented reforms, deregulation, tax cuts. They actually abolished wealth and inheritance taxes, cut corporate taxes, and privatized some state-run services.
So they corrected course, pulled back from the more extreme policies.
Exactly. They found a more sustainable balance. Still high taxes and generous welfare compared to, say, the U.S., but they dialed back the socialism-light elements that were hurting the economy. They learned you can't just tax the rich to pay for everything. The burden falls on the broad population and can dampen dynamism.
You mentioned social trust. That's important. But wasn't there concern even there about incentives?
There was. Even in high-trust Sweden, surveys showed a rising number of people felt it was okay to claim benefits they weren't really entitled to. It went from like 19% in the early 80s to 40% by 2011.
Wow, that's a big jump.
It alarmed policymakers. They tightened eligibility rules, ran campaigns against welfare abuse, fearing an erosion of the work ethic. It suggests that exporting the same model to lower trust societies might be much more problematic.
Okay, so the Nordic model. Possible to have high redistribution with capitalism if you have the right conditions. Strong institutions, trust, existing wealth.
That seems to be the lesson. But it absolutely does not prove that classic socialism, a non-market economy, works. They depend heavily on markets. And they've had to adjust, embrace markets more at times to keep it working.
Constantly adjusting. It's really a model of regulated, high-tax capitalism, not socialism. It shows you can achieve social goals like universal health care within a market framework.
Okay. So let's try to synthesize the overall economic outcomes. Why, according to this analysis, do socialist economies tend to fall short?
Well, if you look broadly at GDP, living standards, innovation, the pattern is pretty clear. The wealthiest nations are overwhelmingly market economies. Countries that went fully socialist ended up poorer, often much poorer, than comparable market economies.
We saw that with Germany, Korea, the U.S. versus the USSR.
Right. Big gaps in income and, just as importantly, in the availability and quality of everyday goods. West had abundance, East had queues and scarcity.
And innovation.
Capitalism seems to drive it much more effectively. Computers, internet, biotech, clean energy largely came out of market economies. Socialist states struggled to innovate outside military or space sectors.
China's transformation after market reforms is a huge piece of evidence here, isn't it? Massive. Stagnant under Mao, then explosive growth and poverty reduction once market incentives were introduced. It highlights the power of markets.
And the inefficiency. That Soviet nail factory anecdote.
Ah, yes. Quota by weight, so they make giant useless nails. Or quota by number, they make tiny useless pins. It shows how central planning, without price signals, leads to absurd waste and mismatch between production and actual need. Gluts of unwanted stuff, shortages of essentials.
Plus, lower quality and less choice for consumers. The Trabant versus a Volkswagen.
Exactly. Capitalism's competition forces firms to improve quality and offer variety. Socialism often meant drab uniformity, limited options. It affects quality of life profoundly.
So connecting back to theory, it really comes down to those core problems.
Pretty much. Lack of price signals leads to misallocation. Weak incentives hurt productivity and innovation. State control leads to bureaucratic rigidity and capital being used for political goals, not economic ones. Lack of financial discipline keeps bad firms alive, wasting resources.
And these effects compound over time, widening the gap.
They do. South Korea ends up 18 times richer than North. Venezuela goes from richest to basket case.
And crucially, countries that reversed socialist policies often saw dramatic improvement.
China, India, Eastern Europe, post-89. The evidence points strongly in that direction. While you have to consider specific contexts, the overall trend suggests socialist economic models consistently underperformed. More socialism generally meant worse outcomes. That's why virtually every country has incorporated market elements now.
Okay, beyond the economics, what about the political and social side? Centralizing economic power.
Means centralizing political power, immense power in the hands of planners and party officials. And history shows that kind of concentrated power is easily abused.
Even if they start with good intentions.
The temptation is strong. To keep the economic plan on track, you might feel you need to silence critics, control information, suppress opposition.
Like in the communist states, controlling everything, media, culture,
Yeah.
crushing civil society.
Right, the state becomes the ultimate employer, landlord, provider. Dissent becomes incredibly risky. Censorship and propaganda become essential tools.
So does real democracy struggle to survive alongside full-blown socialism?
The historical record is stark. We haven't seen it happen successfully. Attempts either failed, got reversed, or slid into authoritarianism like Venezuela.
Why is that tension seemingly inherent?
Well, socialist policies often create conflicts, say, with business owners or farmers. The government might then feel it needs to weaken those groups, which can mean undermining elections or legal rights. Leaders might convince themselves they need to stay in power indefinitely to protect the revolution.
Like Chavez changing the Constitution.
Exactly. And blaming failures on saboteurs or enemies is a common tactic, leading to persecution. Think Stalin and the kulaks, Mao and the Red Guards. It's a dangerous path.
And human rights in general. Property rights, obviously, but others too.
They tend to suffer. Abolishing private property makes citizens vastly more dependent on the state. Freedom of religion was often suppressed. The party couldn't tolerate a rival loyalty.
Freedom of movement, the Berlin Wall.
A brutal symbol. People shot for trying to leave this supposed paradise, North Korea today. Due process, rule of law often ignored in favor of revolutionary justice or broad laws against counter-revolutionary activity. Individual rights took a backseat to the collective, as defined by the state.
What's fascinating here is the ironic outcome. Socialism promising equality.
And often creating a new elite. The nomenclatura in the Soviet Union party officials with special stores, better housing, privileges denied to ordinary people.
So corruption can thrive.
Especially without a free press or opposition to expose it. We see it today in places like Venezuela, where the ruling elite got rich while the country collapsed. Concentrated power breeds corruption.
And socially, does it lead to stagnation?
Often, yes. Censorship. Official ideology, they stifle open debate. Scientific inquiry if it contradicts the party line. Artistic creativity. Think socialist realism art. It can lead to a cultural grayness, a lack of vibrancy.
In just the atmosphere of living under constant surveillance, fear.
It induces fear, self-censorship. People learn to say one thing in public, think another in private, double-think. It erodes trust, which is ironic for an ideology aiming for solidarity.
So, while maybe theoretically possible to have democratic socialism with rights, in practice,
it hasn't worked out. The level of state control required seems fundamentally at odds with pluralism and limited government. The state tended to become monstrous, not wither away.
Okay, let's try to bring it all together, synthesizing the case presented in the sources, economically.
Socialism struggles. Compared to mixed market capitalism, it generally delivers less prosperity, less innovation. The suppression of markets and incentives leads to inefficiency, stagnation. The historical comparisons are pretty stark. Theoretical flaws repeatedly played out in the real world.
And politically and socially.
Comprehensive socialism has never coexisted with full freedom and democracy. The more socialist the system, generally, the more authoritarian it became. Communist regimes are the extreme example, but even milder forms created pressures against liberty, empowered elites, and came at a high human cost.
It's a paradox, then. To get the planned equality, you need concentrated power.
But that very concentration of power undermines freedom and often leads to failure and abuse. Capitalism, despite its flaws, disperses power more, which helps protect both wealth creation and liberty.
And the Nordic model is key here again.
Yes, it shows you can have high redistribution and services, but crucially, without ditching markets and private enterprise. Its success comes from not being fully socialist and by making pragmatic, market-oriented adjustments when needed.
This raises an important question for you to consider.
What's the takeaway for today? The sources suggest the lesson is this. Markets and private enterprise, within a framework of good institutions and the rule of law, seem the most reliable path to economic progress.
But that doesn't mean pure laissez-faire.
Not at all. Good governance can ensure that wealth is shared more broadly through taxes, public goods, safety nets, but without killing the engine of entrepreneurship and innovation. It's about finding that balance.
So the argument is that this balanced approach, refining regulated capitalism, has actually produced better human development outcomes than attempts at radical socialist transformation.
That's what the historical evidence strongly suggests. So it's crucial, the analysis implies, to be critical when you hear calls to completely overthrow market economies. The dream of a planned paradise needs to be weighed against the often harsh realities documented in these sources.
That old saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
It feels relevant here. The track record provides clear warnings. Refining what works liberal democracy, market economics, making them more inclusive and humane seems the more prudent and frankly more proven path toward achieving the very ideals of well-being and fairness that many socialists aspire to.